In the last lecture, I told you that the 1920s actually ended in the last few weeks of October in 1929. I know that must have sounded confusing at the time, but what I mean is, the carefree times, the happy-go-lucky economy, the boom times of the 1920s really came to a screeching halt. It's in October 1929 that we see the emergence of what we call the Great Depression, the worst economic disaster that the United States had ever seen before or since 1929. To some extent, it's a very significant development in world history. It's not just in the United States that this economic downturn has really changed the game, so to speak. If you want to understand the Great Depression and what caused it, the first thing I need you to do is kind of remove from your mind some of these stereotypes and some of these, you can't really call them myths, but popular understandings of the Great Depression and what brought it about in the first place. If you ask a layperson, somebody on the street maybe, what caused the Great Depression, there's a very good chance that they're going to tell you that the collapse of the stock market, the crash of the stock market in late October 1929, that's what brought everything down. Now, they're not entirely wrong, they're just not entirely right. The stock market plays a very critical role in this whole process, but it's probably overplayed in the grand scheme of things. What's going on in the stock market in the 1920s is record highs. I mean, stocks that were blue chip stocks were blowing up all over the place. And so if you're anybody with a little bit of extra cash, or even if you don't have a lot of extra cash, maybe you would take out a loan, invest every last dime that you had in the stock market because it's seen as a slam dunk. Nobody can lose. Let your money work for you. Well, it wasn't as simple as that. And although the people that were getting in the stock market in the mid and late 1920s were getting rich, at least on paper, um, there were fundamental problems that were not being addressed. And a lot of these problems go back to the Harding administration and the Cooling administration and their completely hands-off approach of regulating the American economy, Wall Street included. Now, what a lot of people are doing in the stock market is buying on what we call margin. Now, you and I would call that credit. And it wasn't just in the stock market that people are buying on credit. I introduced you to, Ford Motor Credit and the installment plan and the idea of buying now and paying later. Well, the fact of the matter remains is because people thought they knew that it was only a matter of time that they got rich through investing in the stock market, not only would they take every dime of their savings and throw it in the market, they would also take out loans and put that loan money in there. And when the stocks took off, you would not only make back the money that you borrowed, you could pay back your lenders, you'd also make a little bit from or for yourself as well. Well, because much of the regulations that had been put in place in the Wilson administration had been lifted under Harding and Coolidge, people were doing this, and it's all fine and well as long as the stock market continues to go up. But what happened in October, late October 1929, is a lot of these investment firms began to get cold feet with respect to how top-heavy the market was becoming. And so what they began doing is calling in these loans. And so ordinary people, people like me and you, that had invested all their money, plus some, in the stock market, they simply didn't have the money to pay back their creditors. And assuming for a second that you don't want to sell your house, your car, or your kidney, the one tangible thing that you own, the one thing that could get some money right now if you needed it, to pay back your lenders, that would be the stock itself. And so what happens is people begin to sell back their stocks to get money to pay back their lenders. Well, the problem is everybody is in the same boat. And it's not just me or you or just a few people that are doing this. It's everybody. It's a selling spree. Now, initially when this happens, Thursday, October 26, 1929, what you get is bigwig Wall Street bankers like J.P. Morgan that tried to step in and save the economy. They bought up all this toxic stock, all this stock that had gone from record highs to record lows seemingly overnight. Now, their hope was that they would restore confidence in the economy by putting a bottom floor on it. And when Monday's opening bell rang, it would be back to business as usual. And for the time being, when stocks opened Monday, October 28th, all seemed to be well. And then the following day, what comes to be known as Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, the bottom fell out of the stock market once again. You see the crash of the stock market. And what I need you to understand about Black Tuesday is that's the official date, October 29th, 1929, that most historians will tell you we have entered into the Great Depression. This massive downturn in the American economy that's throwing people out of work by the hundreds of thousands, throwing people out of their houses. People are going hungry. It's general suffering of the American people because of this unprecedented downturn in the American economy. Okay? Now, if you know anything about anything, you'll understand that the Great Depression didn't just happen in an instant in October 1929. And although it clearly had implications to the stock market, there are other things, other factors at work that are bringing about this economic disaster. One is a consumer economy. One causation of the Great Depression would be a consumer economy. Now, like any other decade, the 1920s was a great time to be rich. The problem with the way that the wealth is being distributed in the 1920s is it's not very evenly distributed. I mean, people like Henry Ford are becoming incredibly, incredibly wealthy. And they're using this money to build factories and build lavish homes and buy a high ticket expensive consumer items. But the problem with the Henry Fords of the world is there just isn't enough of them to go around. What made the American economy go in the 1920s, very similar to the 21st century, is middle class consumers. And the fact that the wealth was so stubbornly distributed in the top end of the American economy, in other words, the top 5% of the American economy was bringing home most of the wealth, what that did was it didn't spread the wealth evenly enough to make more consumers. A more equal distribution of the wealth would have made more consumers and more consumer spending. Okay. As we've already mentioned, another contributing factor is this idea of buying on margin. Credit really becomes mainstream, at least for people like me and you in the 1920s. And the idea of buying now and paying later is a great, great thing. It's great for everybody. It's great for the producers. It's great for the middlemen that sell these things, and of course it's great for the consumer to have it now and put off the burden of paying for it at another time. Well, all of this is fine and well as long as you have people that are at least making payments, right? When you don't make payments on your house, for instance, what the bank does is it'll repossess that house. Now, typically, historically, banks don't like to do this because they're left holding the bag on your loan, okay? And of course, they try to resell your home, but typically they take a loss on that. And so when people started defaulting on their home loans, on their car loans, or even on some of their credit lines to buy things like vacuum cleaners, what that did was it made banks and creditors, generally speaking, far less likely to put money out there on the street. In other words, another really big causation of the Great Depression was a lack of credit. Banks and creditors were just simply not lending, and this really kind of, you know, dovetailed on the whole problem of consumer spending. I mean, not only are people not making enough to really go out there and buy these consumer products, now you have lending institutions that are not even loaning them the money to go out there and do that. Another problem and contributing factor would be bank failures, okay? Now, when the Depression hit, one of the things that would circulate in American society are these wild rumors that banks were running out of money, okay, and they were closing, they were failing. The problem when a bank fails, or at least the problem before 1933, is if that bank went down and it had all your savings, all your checking money in there, it went down there with all your money. So if there was this rumor that your bank was on the verge of collapse, what you might be inclined to do is to run down to your bank and take out every dime that you ever invested there. The problem in doing that is our investments, our deposits are the lifeblood of the banking industry. Without them, banks can't do things like make loans, or if much of their capital is taken out, they can't do anything whatsoever, and they completely fail. And so people withdrawing all their money from the banks and a lack in the banking system, lack of confidence in the banking system, that is, it's also a major contributing factor um, when it comes to the Great Depression. Lastly, international finance. Do you remember me talking about how World War I ended? It ended with Germany being blamed for the war and being forced to pay back all the damages that they allegedly caused. And so the problem with this is, and people like John Maynard Keynes, famous economist, would tell people that were willing to listen, you can't do this because it's 1918 and that kind of money doesn't exist and you're going to break the world economy. Well, toward the end of the 1920s, Germany began to default on the loans that it had taken out from a lot of American bankers. And when that happened, the Germans weren't able to pay back the French or the British, and the French and the British weren't able to buy our products. And as you can see, everything's connected here. It's interconnected. So our export market dried up, and it's another contributing factor to the Great Depression. So as you can see, everybody, it's not just one thing that causes the Great Depression. In a lot of ways, it's the perfect storm. It's the collapse of the stock market combined with, a lack of consumer confidence, a lack of consumer spending, a crunch of consumer credit, a lack of an export market, and all of these things are tied in together. Now, what that means to the average Joe American is that his job is very much in jeopardy. Um, when the economy contracts, in other words, when people stop buying things, what that tells producers like Walmart, Home Depot, General Motors, RCA, it tells them we don't need to crank out as much stuff. There's a surplus. Let's get rid of the surplus before we go ahead and increase production. Okay, and so how do you decrease? How do you lessen production? Well, one of the things that you do is you employ fewer and fewer people because you don't need as many people to produce less. So one of the things I need you to understand is when the economy began to contract in 1929, people were fired, they were laid off, they were put out of their jobs. Now, what does that do? Are you more likely or less likely to spend money, especially money on things that you don't absolutely have to have, if you've just lost your job? It's a no-brainer. You stop spending money. And so the problem here is when these people are put out of work, they make the problem worse. They stop spending, and what that tells the producers of the American economy is, once again, slow down production. You don't need as much of this any longer, and they fire more people. They lay off more people. And so you can see it's a downward spiral. The problem is there's nothing that will allow us to hit rock bottom. There's nothing that we can say, this is the worst it's going to get. It can only get better from here. We're going to build ourselves up from here. And so some of the things that this is causing is a lot of human suffering. I mean, you're talking about a generation of Americans that were going hungry, that were malnourished, and suffered from diseases associated with malnutrition, like rickets. People went insane. Divorce rates skyrocketed, maybe not legally on paper, but couples just simply separated. One of the very overlooked aspects of the Great Depression was that it was depressing. It was psychologically depressing. Okay. It also leads to a vicious attack on the foreign-born. Like any downturn in the economy, one of the first groups that gets blamed are immigrants, recent immigrants. As I'm sure you're aware, for the most part, immigrants don't cause any one thing in the economy to happen or not to happen. The reason that you have people trying to get into the United States, or who had come to the United States to begin with, was because we had a vibrant economy. So things were happening here. When you've got a line of people waiting to get into a country, it means that they're doing something right. The economy is good, it's vibrant. Well, this being the case, foreigners or recent immigrants being blamed for the lack of jobs, what this translated into in the early 1930s was the deportation campaigns, or as they were called at the time, the repatriation campaigns. Now, the word repatriation sounds a little misleading. Patriate, to repatriate almost sounds like a positive thing, like you're bringing them back to connection to their former homeland. Really, what you're talking about is specific campaigns that targeted very precise groups of people. And one of the people that I would like you to be mindful of here would be the Mexican community. Mexican/Mexican American is what I probably should say. In places like Los Angeles that had a very large Mexican American population, the city government had a really complicated, complex deportation campaign in which they promised Mexican immigrants, but really you're talking about Mexican Americans, people that had been born and raised in this country, some of whom were well into their 20s at the time, promised them a ride home. Really what they meant was you would be taken to the Mexican border and you'd be dumped off, and then you would become Mexico's problem. Well, aside from the clearly racist overtones to that, you've got the problem of illegal deportations. And what I mean by that is really not a deportation whatsoever. It's almost like being forced into exile. What you call somebody that was born in Los Angeles, whether they come from Canadian ancestry or Mexican ancestry, French, you get the idea. You call them an American citizen. If they're born in Los Angeles, which is a part of the United States, they are an American citizen, and you can't just up and deport an American citizen. But because of some of these people whose parents had come from Mexico, had been born in the United States, they were part of a family, many of them were rounded up and forced to comply with these deportation campaigns. Now think about it. If things are this bad in the United States, what makes you think that it's that much better in Mexico, where Mexico can handle all of these people being dumped off on it in the first place? Okay? And so really what you see are people, that are becoming more and more desperate, and they need somebody to blame. And increasingly, it's going to be the foreign-born or minorities of foreign parentage that are going to suffer from most of this blame. And the best example that we can point to when it comes to that aspect of human suffering would be the repatriation campaigns of the early 1930s. And for the record, it wasn't just Los Angeles that participated in these campaigns. You had cities far removed from the Southwest, places like Gary, Indiana, or Detroit, Michigan, that were also targeting Mexicans and Mexican Americans for these deportation campaigns. But all across America, you had the problem of homelessness, you had the problem of hunger, you had the problem of the Hooverville, right? The president at the time was a guy named Herbert Hoover, and then, now, or any time in between, the person that typically gets blamed for a downturn in the American economy would be the president that's in the White House at the time, and that just so happened to be Herbert Hoover. So they would call these homeless encampments, where in some cases thousands of homeless men and women kind of huddled together. They would call them the Hooverville, kind of sarcastically naming them after the very controversial American president at the time. Okay. Now, we need to talk a little bit about how America is responding to this Great Depression. Actually, that's kind of a bad way of thinking about it, considering in the early days there's not very much of a response whatsoever. Herbert Hoover's response, the president's response, Washington's response, if you will, was very minute. Hoover was very similar in his political orientation to Coolidge and Harding, to a good extent, in the sense that he did not think that the best idea was an active federal government in the American economy, felt that the best thing that a president could do when it comes to encouraging the economy to do well was to just stay out of it. Let Henry Ford do what Henry Ford was good at. Well, what that means is you're really not going to have the federal government, at least under Hoover anyway, really make a meaningful response to the human suffering that I've just outlined for you. So what about unions or city governments or mutual aid societies, organizations that we've talked about caring for their own? Well, when you had fewer and fewer parishioners in your church, you had fewer and fewer dues-paying union members, or if you were a city like Detroit that got absolutely hammered by the Great Depression, there's very little that you can do because you're taking in less and less and less and less money. And so these local institutions are absolutely overwhelmed by the great need for assistance during this period. So you're not really going to see a whole lot of response coming from the local and state governments. Where I'm going with this is any kind of meaningful response is probably going to come from the local level and the community level. That's worth noting. One of the only organizations in American life that's really doing anything about the Great Depression, I mean, that would be the American Communist Party. Okay. The American Communist Party, we've talked about them before. We know that their stated purpose was the destruction of the American government by any means necessary. But the Great Depression is really providing a unique opportunity for communists to really expand their membership, their propaganda, and maybe even their movement. Now, in the early 1930s, what you've got is the Communist Party really beginning to address some of these pressing social issues. For example, one of the things that communist organizations, unemployed councils, or what have you, would do was they would participate in what was called a rent strike. Now, evictions, as I've told you, evictions were a really big problem in the Great Depression, considering not too many people could afford to pay their rent on a regular month-by-month basis. And so when the sheriff's department would come put this family out, this communist unemployed council would just wait until the police had left, and then they would take everybody's belongings from the curb, they would break back into the house, they'd put the belongings back in the house, and put the family back in the house. Now, you ask yourself, what's stopping the police from coming back and doing it all over again? Well, nothing, but the police are going to have to come back and do the whole thing all over again. And once again, the communists would move them right back in after the police left. So as you can see, this becomes a real sharp thorn in the side of local police departments. But from the perspective of the little guy, the guy that's being put out of their home, it looks like the communists are really standing up for them. Okay? Speaking of standing up for underprivileged groups, in the early 1930s, several African American youths, boys really, that were riding the trains from town to town in the South. I mean, that was not something that was exclusive to the African American community. Everybody rode the train as stowaways, as hobos, hoping that the town down the road would be a little bit better than the town that they were coming from. Well, anyway, in Scottsboro, Alabama, these 9 African American boys are accused of raping 2 white girls who were on the train car with them as they were traveling. Now, these girls report the incident, or the alleged incident, to the local law enforcement authorities. Now, you have to understand, just being accused of rape in Alabama in this particular time period, that's enough to get you hanged in general, okay? So it's almost like a death sentence. Forget about the trial. What the communist role in what comes to be known as the Scottsboro Boys case involves is the Communist Party donating its legal resources. It paid for the legal representation of the Scottsboro Boys, which ultimately ended in a mistrial in the early 1930s. So once again, when it comes to Number one of the groups that's most hardest hit by this, racial and ethnic minorities. I've already given you the case of Mexican Americans. African Americans would be the first fired from their jobs because of clearly racist foremen and employers. It looks as if the communists are standing up for the people that cannot stand up for themselves. Um, to that end, I'd like you to be mindful of a very important event that takes place in 1932 called the Ford Hunger March. Okay. Now, to that end, the Communist Party plays a very significant role in organizing the Ford Hunger March. Now, what the Ford Hunger March is a march on the Ford Motor Company. Okay. It's organized by the communists in March 1932, and what they want to do is they want to bring a list of demands to Henry Ford. Most of this includes things like providing food and coal for the winter months, providing jobs, taking a much more proactive role in addressing the economic crisis that Ford himself was so instrumental in bringing about. Um, Ford, as you might imagine, is not too keen on this idea. And so, as the march proceeds from Detroit into Ford's hometown of Dearborn, as they get ready to present their list of demands, um, the Dearborn police attack the marchers, and machine guns that had been mounted on top of Ford's factories opened up fire, and it killed 4 people and wounded scores more. Now, the significance of the Ford Hunger March, I need you to understand why this is so important. Why not go to Washington? Why not march on Washington? Or at least, why not march on the state capital of Michigan? Why not march on City Hall in Detroit? The symbol of successful capitalism in the 1920s was Henry Ford. He was arguably the most famous businessman in the world at the time. And with this reputation came a lot of political and economic clout. And when Henry Ford said something was so, it meant that something was so. Most Americans simply took him at face value. Well, when Henry Ford goes ahead and attacks the people that were simply asking him for a job, it really destroyed his credibility. I mean, not only was capitalism on its face, what it's doing is it's destroying the philosophy that Henry Ford had tried to make so mainstream, that the best thing that the government can do when it comes to encouraging the economy to do well is nothing. So for your notes, what the Ford Hunger March is so significant for is not necessarily just the fact that Ford attacked these people. It was the complete discrediting of the belief in laissez-faire capitalism, the idea that you don't need to regulate capitalism in order to have a fully functioning economic society. Okay. Now, this is also not very good news for Herbert Hoover. Um, the fact that you've got people that are marching on Henry Ford is one thing. The fact that Ford is actually attacking them to the point that 4 people are dying, that's even worse. But later on that year in 1932, you're going to see a march on Washington of sorts. And the marchers are going to be World War I veterans, people that had served in World War I. And because of their service, the government had promised them an enlistment bonus. In other words, in 1945, they would receive a bonus for their service in World War I. Well, in 1932, a lot of them got together and decided to march to Washington to ask Hoover for the funds early. They knew that it was much earlier than 1945, but they said they needed the money now, and because that they had diligently served their country, honorably served their country, they deserved it now. Well, not only did Hoover say, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to pay you, you're going to have to wait, but he dispatched General MacArthur to disperse the crowd. Now, for reasons that Hoover never really ever did make clear, MacArthur grossly exceeded his orders. I don't necessarily know what threat MacArthur thought this quote-unquote bonus army, as it came to be known, what threat the bonus army represented. But in any case, not only did he drive them out of the Anacostia Flats where they had camped. He put their camp to torch. Now, think about it. This is the American government mobilizing its armed forces against not only its citizens, its veterans. Right? This is a horrible, horrible publicity stunt for the Hoover administration. So going into 1932, I think you could say that Hoover's reelection prospects were doubtful. He was very much unliked because he had such an introverted kind of personality. He kind of came across as callous and uncaring, not able to really connect with the severity of the Great Depression on a middle class, working class level. But what really kind of sealed his fate politically was the bonus march and the bonus army. When MacArthur really went after the bonus army, what that did is it put Hoover in a position where he had to really reprimand MacArthur. And for reasons that he never really explained, he doesn't do that. He doesn't really discipline him, at least not publicly. He doesn't discipline them. And so what this does is it pretty much makes his reelection absolutely impossible. And in 1932, when voters go to the polls, they're not going to be thinking Hoover for 4 more years. Um, as I'd mentioned before, anytime you've got a downturn in the economy, typically the American voters take it out on the president who was in the White House at the time. The guy that's promising hope and change, and the glory days are gonna be back very soon as you elect me. Typically, that's the person that gets elected. And that's certainly going to be the case for Herbert Hoover, and that's where we'll pick it up the next time we meet.